get away from the tropics, the warmer areas, all the orchids tend to be terrestrial, meaning that they grow in the ground, but it's usually in a very loose sandy soil or leaf litter, very well drained. We don't see much of those at the shows or at our nurseries and whatever, but there's actually one that grows in Thousand Oaks. It's called the stream orchid, and it's the orchid that's on the society logo. So one rule of thumb is never to plant an orchid in potting soil. The roots will not get the air circulation that they need, and the plant's just going to rot and die. There are some people, a friend of mine, who has been able to successfully grow cymbidiums in the ground out here in Thousand Oaks, but he put a lot of soil amendments in to keep it very loose and airy. So it is possible, but general rule of thumb is never use potting soil. Use orchid bark or some other orchid potting mix. So just generally epiphytes. This is a shot I took when we were at Tikal in Guatemala. And this is the way orchids in the natural state get their food. All the little white spots are bird poop. So that's what they're going to get, whatever basically they're growing up in the trees. We took a zip line tour, and up in the canopy of the trees, you saw all these orchids growing wild. It's a very nutrient poor environment. So that's another thing to keep in mind for later when we talk fertilizer. These are orchids in a real tropical environment. This is in the rainforest on the northeast coast of Australia. And we were there in, I forget what time of year, none of them were in bloom, but once you start to pick them out and see where they are growing, you start to see orchids all over the place. And they're growing up and down the trunks of trees and on the ferns, and usually not at the tops of the trees. It's too bright, too much sunlight at those levels, but certainly not down on the floor where it's much darker. This is in Belize in Central America. This is an interesting one. Used to be called encyclia, now it's a prosthecia, and I think in the last talk that we had, it's now called something different, but this is called the black orchid or the cockleshell orchid. It's the national flower of Belize, and it's you can find it all the way through Central America into southern Florida, and the Santa Barbara Orchid Estate does have this in stock. I also have one growing in the yard here, and I occasionally am able to get a couple of divisions off it. And it's a very prolific grower, loves the area here. And when it starts to bloom, the inflorescence or the spike just keeps growing longer and longer and longer. A single spike will be in bloom for maybe 3 or 4 months. Lithophytes. These are some of the dendrobiums that you see in eastern and southeastern Australia, and particularly this class on the one on the right, the Dendrobium kingianum, the Dendrobium specianum, the one on the left, and you see these usually at the Santa Barbara Orchid Estate and the Santa Barbara Show. And then in between the two is a hybrid of the two species. It's called a delicatum. They do beautifully outdoors here in Southern California. Don't require a lot of repotting, and I would say take a look at Cal Orchid and Orchid Estate for plants in this category. The way I plant these up is a mix, about 50% coarse bark and 50% rock, and that could be lava rock or the kind of admix that you use when you're making concrete. Then you have your terrestrial orchids. And these typically grow from a tuber in the ground. The one on the left is the Epipactis gigantea, which is on our logo and is found in a few closely held locations in Thousand Oaks. They don't want people going in collecting. But these are found all across North America, into Northern Europe, and into Siberia. So there's two major types of orchids in terms of the way they grow. The ones that you see most frequently are what is called sympodial, which means walking along or moving along and foot, because what you end up with is what's called a rhizome, which is like you can think of it as like a branch that grows along the surface of the ground, and you'll have pseudobulbs growing up from that rhizome. Each pseudobulb, at the base of the pseudobulb, has two eyes that can grow into a new growth. Typically, one will grow and the other one is kind of held in reserve. It's more of a survival thing. If the plant gets damaged, it can always send out now that second eye, have it mature and grow off with a new rhizome. So if you have something like this that's starting to get leggy in your pot, you want to divide it. What you would do is get it out of the pot, remove all the mix or as much from the roots as you can, and then cut through the rhizome. One thing you would really like to do then is to put some cinnamon powder on both cut surfaces. That helps it to dry out. And also cinnamon is something of an antiseptic. Basically, trees that grow in the tropics have to protect against fungus and all kinds of other nasty things. So they generate all kinds of chemicals to protect themselves. Cinnamon is one of them. And rule of thumb with any orchids that you divide like this also goes for cymbidiums, is you want to have 3 good pseudobulbs per division. So you have a strong, healthy plant to go forward. And examples are cattleyas, lalias, oncidiums, cymbidiums, very long list. You would think cymbidiums, when you start to separate these things in the pot, when you're dividing it, that there isn't a pseudobulb, a rhizome there, but it's because the rhizomes are extremely short for cymbidiums. So the easiest way to divide a cymbidium is to grab 2 sections of the plant and just pull. And they'll separate, or you may have to cut through a section and maybe lose one of the bulbs. But basically, most of the orchids you're going to see have that type of growth pattern. Then you have what's called monopodial. Mono meaning 1 foot, podial or pod meaning the word together meaning 1 foot. So what you have is a plant that grows vertically. You can't take a cutting of it, take the top of it off, and I think Kathy may correct me on that. I think you may be able to do that with Vandas, but generally speaking, particularly the Phalaenopsis that you see at Trader Joe's and Home Depot, you don't divide these plants. You hope and pray that they're healthy enough that they'll send out a new growth from the base. And then once it's large enough and has its own roots, you can gently separate it from the original plant. And that's how you would propagate one of these plants. Now, the other thing going back is plants that have pseudobulbs. The pseudobulb stores water and nutrients. So it can go reasonable amount of time without water. And you'll start to see the pseudobulb kind of start to shrink, and you'll see like little ribs starting to form. Not so with the monopodial orchids. They have no way to store water. So when you're watering these guys, you wait until the mix has almost dried out and then water it thoroughly. Make sure the roots have a nice, good long drink of water. But you don't want these things to dry out for very long. So examples would be the Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid, and then the Paphiopedilum and Phragmipediums, which are also referred to as slipper orchids. So what do orchids need to be healthy? You need moving air. Again, I mentioned gas exchange. Just like the leaves, they take in CO2, they give off oxygen. If they're starved of that, if they're in standing water, that will kill them. So if you have a Phalaenopsis that you got from Home Depot and it's sitting inside of a nice ceramic pot that doesn't have any holes in the bottom, make sure when you water it that you take out the inner sleeve, you water that, let the water drain out, and then drop it back in the nice glazed ceramic pot. If you just water it as is and let the water stand in there, good night orchid. Water quality. You generally want low mineral content. You talk about hard water and all the other bad things that you can have in it. It turns out that the water in the Thousand Oaks area is actually pretty good, typically about what they call 200 parts per million, and that's okay for most of the orchids you're going to see. You go into other water districts, and the mineral content can be much higher, many times higher. So the best thing to do is, if you live in one of the other local communities, to check with your local water source, and they'll give you an idea. They should have a water quality report to tell you, what the mineral content is. And they call it total dissolved solids. If you go down to like San Diego, they're talking about 800 parts per million coming out of the tap. You need to truck in water for your pool because you're supposed to change your pool water when it gets above 400. Some orchids, particularly some of the species from higher elevations like in the Andes, they require really pure water, either distilled or reverse osmosis. And then when you use pure water, you need to use fertilizer that provides some of the what they call micronutrients like calcium and magnesium that they would normally get in tap water. So it's always good, particularly if you're getting species, to find out if they need any kind of special attention in terms of water requirements. Light. Most orchids don't like a whole lot of direct sunlight unless it's, say, early morning, late afternoon. Most of them, to be safe, you want to have probably 50% shade. So underneath trees where you're getting some dappled sunlight is good. I have some out on a patio area, and I actually have some shade cloth on top of the patio cover because in between those slats, it's getting 100%, and I've seen burns coming from that. Fertilizer, I gave a session on that at our last meeting. And the typical thing is to remember just water weekly, fertilize weekly. So once a week, use a very weak solution of fertilizer. Most of the orchid fertilizers, they'll tell you about a teaspoon per gallon of water. You're best off probably going half of that, half a teaspoon or maybe even less per gallon of water. Temperature. There are orchids, some of those Australian orchids that I mentioned, the dendrobiums, they can take temperatures down into the mid-20s and up to about 100. You do have to provide some sun protection when it gets really hot, but there are a lot of orchids that have much narrower temperature ranges where they're happy. What you're going to want to do is, if you can, find orchids that are listed as temperature tolerant. The Orchid Estate in Santa Barbara actually puts that on their labels. The people at the Cal Orchid, they have a whole area that they say outdoor growing orchids. Beyond that, you'll see some that's usually say either cool, warm, or intermediate. And there you really need to look it up to see what that means for that particular orchid. And I grow almost everything outdoors. And I found areas in the yard that are a little bit milder than others. And I do have some plants that I have to bring in the winter because it's getting too cold, but I avoid the cool ones, and I avoid ones that just say intermediate because then it might get a little bit too warm in the summer. Then you need to worry about what you're going to pot it in. They need to be very well drained mixes or mounted. And some of you were at the talk by Alfred Hockenmeyer on mounting orchids. A lot of good information there. If you're potting up in a pot, number one, make sure you got a lot of large drain holes in the bottom of the pot, and you set it down on a surface that isn't going to block the water from draining out. You take like an azalea pot, you put it on a nice piece of nice area of concrete on like a sidewalk. It's not guaranteed to drain that water. So you may want to set it up on a little stand or something like that. Growing outdoors, I put about 1 inch of rock in the bottom of the pot, not really necessary. But then with the type of mix you're going to use, rule of thumb is look for an orchid bark, not any kind of landscape bark, but orchid bark specifically. And the fatter the roots on the orchid, the larger the bark. So if you're potting up a Phalaenopsis or Cattleya, something in that category, you're going to use a medium to large bark. If you're doing Oncidiums, they have much finer roots. You use a finer bark, or what they call a seedling bark. And then you can get fancy and mix in some perlite or maybe a little bit of finer lava rock. But the main thing is the roots need to have air to be able to get into the mix in between watering so that they can dry out a bit. This chart, if I recall, is available on our website, and it shows by the type of orchid, the amount of light that they feel the happiest in, okay? Now, if you don't have any way to measure foot candles, the easiest way to think of it is on the low end, that's complete shade, okay? On the high end, that could be very bright sun in the early morning or late afternoon. So you're talking about something that can take a fair bit of light, but you don't want it to be seeing any kind of direct sun anywhere past like mid-morning to mid-afternoon. There are a few exceptions, and the best thing to do is to look up a specific plant online and see what they say as far as the light requirements. And you can see here the Phalaenopsis down near the bottom, that you're going to want to grow indoors, relatively low light. I actually have mine in an east window. It doesn't really get any direct sun because I am shaded from my neighbor's house, but it is a very bright window, and you need a certain minimum amount of light to get these guys to bloom. On the high end, the Oncidiums, Dendrobiums, Cymbidiums, they can stand a lot more light. So, rules of thumb. First thing, if your orchid isn't blooming, and they're only going to bloom once a year, there are only a very rare number that will bloom more than once a year. So if it isn't blooming, hasn't bloomed for a good year, it's most likely because it's not getting enough light. And particularly if you look at Cymbidiums, if they have nice dark green leaves, probably not getting enough light. A good healthy Cymbidium should have something of a sort of a lighter green color to it. You don't want to give it so much light that it burns, so much sun that it burns, but they need that minimum amount of light to bloom. Now, one other thing, let's say you've got a plant outside and it's been growing in a very bright area and it's about to bloom. You're going to bring it in so you can enjoy it indoors. Well, it's going to be a lot darker indoors, and while it's indoors, it's going to start producing a lot more chlorophyll to make enough food for itself. That's going to make the leaves a whole lot darker. Darker leaves absorb more light. You take it back outdoors, you put it out where you had it before, come out the next morning, the leaves are burned. So when you're returning an orchid to its outdoor location, make sure it's gradually moved into that area so that it doesn't get burned, seeing that transition to that high level of light. And just another thing here is it's not the amount of light that damages the orchid, it's the temperature that the leaf gets to. So you could have a plant growing perfectly well in some area of the yard, and all of a sudden we end up with a day like we had 2 years ago with 105, 106 degrees, and certainly the amount of sun was the same, but the plants got cooked. So you have to worry about excessive temperatures for all of your plants. It's not just the amount of light. Fertilizer, I don't know that we need to go over this. We talked about it at a recent meeting in the culture session. This presentation, a more complete discussion of fertilizer is in the latest newsletter, but these are the fertilizers that I've been using for years. The Grow More fertilizers, the high nitrogen for cymbidiums in the summer, the red one. The yellow is the balanced for almost everything else year round. The blue is the bloom formula for cymbidiums in the fall and for some of the other plants. And the green is the formula that doesn't have any urea in it for nitrogen. And that's what the Phalaenopsis and the slipper orchids and mounted orchids would like. I will mention this Nutricoat time release fertilizer. You can use that in place of these liquid fertilizers, particularly for cymbidiums. It's a once a year thing. 1 tablespoon of these pellets each year in the spring, and they'll carry you through. You don't need to provide any other fertilizer. And I do have that available for sale at cost. This was material that we bought last year for the club and for our library show sale. And I believe it's about $1.65 a pound. You can pay $13 a pound buying it online. If you're interested, just drop me an email. You go to Home Depot and they sell time release fertilizer, Osmocote. Don't use it on orchids. It releases too much fertilizer too fast and it will burn the orchids. So I mentioned, I said, so you've got an orchid, you bought it, it had a beautiful flower, it hasn't bloomed again. So what's the problem? Number 1 on the list, these guys might just be testing you, testing your patience. The other thing I mentioned is that most of them only bloom once a year. It might not be getting enough light, or it doesn't like where you're growing it. Maybe the temperature is too extreme on the high end or the low end, or it might have a problem with insects or diseased, or always check occasionally to see if the roots are damaged. Because if it looks like it's withering, like it's too dry, it could be that it's been too wet, that the bark is broken down and the roots are rotting because they've been too wet. So also pay attention to how frequently you repot, replace that bark as it breaks down. In the future sessions, we'll be talking more about insects and disease and how to control that in the collection. And let's see, just in general terms, the plants you're going to find at the local retail shops, Phalaenopsis, those are the moth orchids that everybody gives as gifts. That includes what I call the ugly dyed ones. I only tend to see them at Albertsons though. Dendrobiums, you'll see those occasionally at Trader Joe's. Some of the intergenerics as well, the Oncidium types. Some of those are called dancing lady orchids. And cymbidiums, you'll tend to see them more at Costco and some at Home Depot. You say, well, why, if there are so many thousands of types of orchids, why are those the only ones you see in the retail stores? And that's because these are the ones that have blooms that last the longest, many months in some cases. It's easy for a store to take in an inventory and set it on the shelf and occasionally spritz it with a little water. And they don't have to worry that the plant's going to drop all of its flowers in a week or two, and then they can't sell them. So really what you'd like to do is move beyond some of these plants and get into some really interesting orchids. And just mentioning some of the ones, excuse me, some of the ones that you really want to take a good look at is if you look at Cattleyas, and there's also a thing called the Cattleya Alliance. And these are all the other orchids that can breed with Cattleyas, making hybrids. So Laelias, Prosovolas, Sophronitis, and they've been changing the names around, but that hasn't hit the nurseries. They're not changing their labels. The Cattleyas are what you would call the corsage orchids. A lot of them, and the Laelias and Prosovolas are fragrant, really nice for the collection. Zygopetalums. These tend to have more of a purple background with dark stripes, very fragrant. Paphiopedilums and Phragmipediums. These are lady slipper orchids. They don't like cool temperatures. Personally, I've not had the greatest success with them. Gail Brody on the other side of town, that's pretty much her specialty, and she's had great success, and other people have great success growing them indoors. What my problem is, I don't know. Then there are what I call the interesting dendrobiums. The Australian type, the nobile type. The Australian type, anybody can grow in their garden. My two sons, one's up in Simi where it's dry as a bone, the other one's in Moore Park. They always forget to water them. They tend to bloom every year. And then you get into one of the largest classes of orchids, bulbophyllums, that you almost never see outside of a place like Orchid Estate or Cal Orchid. Very interesting. They require more humidity, obviously more than I have where I grow mine. Some of them are fragrant. Some of them smell something awful. But they're extremely interesting flowers that are worth having a look at. And then you have miniatures, and one of the large area groups there is called Pleurothallus, and they're from the Americas, and they can grow on a windowsill. I've got some mounted growing out in my side yard. I found a number of them that are actually quite hardy, and some of them bloom for an extended period of time. Epidendrums, Cal Orchid, they're specialists in creating new hybrids, very hardy plants. Vandas, the type that you see people growing all over South Florida. Some varieties can do rather well out here, and I have to report that I have the first spike on one of my Vandas after being hesitant to try them for a long time. And then you have the species, which really takes you into, these are the plants that you find in nature. They haven't been hybridized to optimize the color, the flower size, or how well they can stand a range of temperatures. And probably one of the best sources there is, again, the Orchid Estate in Santa Barbara and Andy's Orchids down in San Diego. And just things that I found grow well outdoors here in Southern California, the Mexican and the Brazilian or purpurata Laelias. The Mexican Laelias like to bloom in the fall and the winter and put on quite a show. There's a lot of variety there. The Brazilian ones, the purpuratas, big, large flowers, spring and summer. The LC Laeliocattleyas, the hybrids, Australian dendrobiums, cymbidiums, cattleyas. The main thing is experiment and find a good spot in your garden. Again, you want to provide some protection from sun, keep them in a relatively cool area. But these are some of the Australian dendrobiums. The Kingiatum on the upper left is the smaller of the group. This clump is of a plant that started out in a 3-inch pot about, I don't know, 25 years ago. The one on the upper right is the large one, a speciosum. Again, Orchid Estate is a great source. And then the delicatum down in the bottom, that was one that picked up from an Australian vendor a number of years ago. And they also have delicatums at Orchid Estate. It's intermediate between the Kingianum and speciosum. Always, you get the tag from the vendor with the complete name. Always keep the tag. Attach it to the growth, keep it in the pot, keep an extra copy someplace. You can always look up the name of that plant on the internet and get more specific information on how that particular species or hybrid is best grown, because they all vary just by a little bit. The other thing is, if you want to have it in a show like at Santa Barbara or the Huntington show, we have to put a label on each plant. We don't want to put a label that says, Cymbidium, we don't know the name. And if you want to enter the plant for judging, it has to have a name. So keep those labels. Unfortunately, the ones you get at Trader Joe's, sometimes the best description on the label says something like exotic orchid, which isn't a whole big help. So again, this is basically going over, what does this all mean? This is a tag from Orchid Estate. So after all the, to me, meaningless numbers on the upper left, it says CATT, which means Cattleya. Undine is the name of the hybrid. And then in the parentheses below, it's telling you which 2 plants were used to crossbreed and make that hybrid. And then a little bit of a description when it's going to bloom. And notice it says temperature tolerant. That's key. They've done a really good job, and there's actually a little brochure that they have available at Orchid Estate describing what range of temperatures each one or each category of temperature tolerant orchid will do the best in. So minimize your risk and your loss, and get something that says temperature tolerant, so you're not constantly worrying about what the temperature is doing day and night. This next one, again, this is basically just defining this LCN. Tells you what the genus is, the particular class of orchid, and then the name that was given to it. And they don't tell you what the cross is. It's obviously a hybrid. And then the name in quotes was the name that the grower gave to that particular hybrid. And anybody can name a plant however they want. And then they also will have some code that will tell you if it got an award from the American Orchid Society. HCC, highly commended. AM is award of merit. And FCC, the highest, is what they call the first class certificate. And I believe we have this list also on the website. And this is just giving you the names that stand behind all the little abbreviations that you're going to see on the tags. And I do know that on the website, we do have a couple of files that have vastly more extensive listings of orchid name abbreviations, listing them both by the abbreviation and by the actual name. So if you get something you don't recognize, you can go and find that in one of the files on the COS website, or you could always just do a Google search. And I've done something where I just type the word orchid, I type the abbreviation, and bingo, I have it right like that. And where else can you get information? The organization, the club, has its own library. The listing of books and pamphlets that we have available is on the website, and the librarian is Ava Gago, and her contact information is in the directory. And once we're allowed to go outdoors again, that's a great resource. I get a ton of information directly from the internet. You can go to the sites from the different nurseries, different orchid societies, and then just doing Google searches. There are a ton of other information sites and blog sites. One of the best places that I've found is the website for the St. Augustine Orchid Society in South Florida. And some of the information is more specific to their environment, but there's an absolute wealth of material there that is available to look at. And one of their members, her name is Sue Bottom, writes articles for Orchids magazine. A lot of those are then, she has permission to put them on her website, on the St. Augustine website. And I contacted her a couple of weeks ago, and she gave us permission to distribute some of her articles within the club. Now, anybody, any of us can go directly to that website and download those articles as PDF files. But there's everything there about how to grow, how to propagate any type of orchid you can possibly imagine, diseases, what to look for, what insecticides and fungicides you can use, just a ton of information. And I'll just say that when you're looking up culture information, Thousand Oaks isn't South Florida or the UK. It also isn't Simi Valley or Westlake Village or Ventura. And what I found is my side yard is very different from my patio. So you have to take a lot of the very specific information that you find and kind of tailor it to your own growing environment, and maybe do a few experiments along the way. And you may lose one or two, but once you find the sweet spot, it's really rewarding. The other thing is, don't be afraid to ask questions of the vendor when you buy an orchid. Find out, what they recommend. Tell them where you live. Tell them where you would be growing the orchids. If the guy doesn't want to share the information with you, I wouldn't buy the orchid from him. But in my experience, I've never had that problem. They're always, they want you to be successful. So you're going to come back and buy more. So it's always is good to have that discussion. Also, ask other members of the society. We did a survey last year, and some members said that they didn't realize or didn't feel comfortable calling up or talking to one of the other members about, asking questions. That's what we're all here for. We're here to learn and to share information. So don't be bashful. There are no dumb questions. So that was the main part of the talk. And I thought if anybody was interested, I would just throw some other interesting stuff out there about orchids. I mentioned that they're very ancient in their origin. They're the second oldest class of flowering plants on Earth. They're very primitive in the reproductive structure of the plant. They've been able to find fossil evidence of pollinia. This is the little waxy capsule that contains the pollen, at least 100 million years old. And then looking at what's called DNA diversity, they're figuring now upwards of 200 million years. And I have another chart that explains what I'm going to say next. It says some of them must have developed and evolved before the breakup of Pangea. And that's on the next chart. In the meantime, right now, there's an estimated between 25 and 30,000 orchid species. These are not hybrids, crossbreeding. These are distinct species around the world, and over 200,000 registered hybrids. And in terms of the number of species, they represent 10% of all the plants that generate seeds on planet Earth. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. And there's a caveat to that statement. They found fossil evidence of orchids in Antarctica from a time when Antarctica was in a different location and had more of a subtropical environment. Right now, they're found in every climate except the most arid deserts and the high Arctic. And there's a terrestrial orchid that grows in Thousand Oaks. So Pangea. What we've determined is that over millions of years, the earth masses, the land masses of the earth have moved around as these, what they call tectonic plates, have moved around due to what's going on inside the Earth's core. And going back, this is 225 million years ago, pretty much all the earth masses were basically together in one supercontinent. It was called we've called it Pangea, meaning one Earth. And during the time of the dinosaurs, from about 250 million years ago to 65 million years ago, Pangea started to split up and land masses began to move. The tectonic plates started to shift. And by 65 million years ago, when the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, most of the major land masses had separated. And if you look at the map that shows 65 million years, this big thing that looks like an island just east of Africa, that's India. It continued north and slammed into South Asia and created the Himalayas. This other landmass that's just east of Antarctica is what's now Australia. So you can see how everything was kind of moving apart. So the interesting thing is the slipper orchids, the paths and the frags and whatnot, they appear, some of the ancestors of the current ones appear across North America into Europe and Asia. So they had to have been present when this was all connected about 200 million years ago. Some of the later orchids on the scene basically evolved later. The Cattleyas, epidendrums, pleurothalids, and others only occur in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. Phalaenopsis, dendrobiums, cymbidiums, and others only in the Eastern Hemisphere. And then Africa is kind of a world to its own. So you can, from looking at that and the DNA evidence, they're able to kind of pin sort of like broad timelines of when orchids developed. And then how do people how have people used orchids? A lot of it's been used in folk medicines and cures and aphrodisiacs. In one of the orchids that we have, I think Kathy has, and a bunch of us have gotten from Kathy, this Blatia, they boil that and use it to cure poisoning from fish in the West Indies. In Malaysia, another orchid, they boil the leaves to make like a tea to prevent sickness after childbirth. Some are used as diuretics. In Ecuador, they use a mucilage from catasetum, supposed to be good for healing broken bones. On the food end, vanilla we're all familiar with. This is a vine that a number of different species, big one growing in the conservatory at the Huntington. And it's the cured pod of the vanilla that we use for flavoring. In Malaysia, there's the leaves of a type of orchid that's sold as a vegetable. And in the tropics in Asia, the tubers of one of the ground orchids actually is eaten like potatoes. One of the more interesting ones is called salep. And it's from Turkey, Greece, basically that area around the Middle East. And it's basically the roasted and ground up tubers of the orchid orchis. And it's used as a flower substitute. So salep itself is a traditional hot drink in Turkey and in parts of the Arab world and Greece, and was actually popular in England and Germany for a while. They called it saloop. And I don't know what flavor it has, but they typically add cinnamon to it. And in Turkey, they sell on the street corners as Turkish ice cream, this dondurma. And they, on the right-hand side here, this shows the tubers of the Orchis moskul. The species Orchis means testicle. Okay, enough said. Turkey harvests 30,000 tons of these things a year. This is a ground orchid. It takes 1,000 to 4,000 tubers to make 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds of flower. And of course, now the plants are nearing extinction. So Turkish ice cream, it's interesting. We toured Turkey a few years ago, and in Istanbul, every place you go, they have these little kiosks and vendors selling the Turkish ice cream. They're all dressed up in old Ottoman garb, you know, the real fancy vests and whatnot and little caps. They put on a show, and the stuff is very chewy. It's stretchy. It's very sticky, and it doesn't really melt. It kind of sits there. And we didn't taste it ourselves. It's more of a tourist experience, but it was very interesting.
Well, I have a quick question while you're trying to figure that out. Maybe you can, you mentioned the fertilizer, the Fails, the green one, and the Nutricoat. Do you use both or just one or just the Nutricoat?
Oh, for Fails, I just use the green urea free.
Not the Nutricoat.
Right.
Okay.
So if you go back into screen sharing, we saw your desktop briefly.
I don't know, for some reason, it's not allowing me to open the Zoom meeting.
You're there.
You're there. You're at the meeting.
Gotta go to share screen at the bottom on the toolbar at the bottom. Share screen.
I'm not seeing anything from Zoom.
Well, you're there. Why don't we go to questions then? Does anybody have any questions? Raise your hand. Use your, okay. Bobby does. Bobby was first.
Okay.
I have been repotting my orchids. I've been putting in the Nutricoat when I'm done potting. So yeah. Does that mean I should not weekly feed my orchids as well? This Nutricoat is enough?
The Nutricoat should be enough.
And if I did the green stuff, that's too much on top of that?
Can you see that?
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
See. Yeah, so
because I would ask the same question.
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking Phalaenopsis?
All of my orchids.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to over fertilize. I would have to take a look and see what the for the Nutricoat. I think I have a copy of the label electronically stored someplace that describes what the composition is. You know, basically what the sources of nitrogen are in the fertilizer. So I'll check into that.
Thank you.
Amanda?
Yes, oh, wait, can you bring it?
All right, I'll get it.
Hold on,
Hang on.
because I have this orchid that I got it 2 years ago over at the Santa Barbara festival, and it's outside, but it always water, it always fertilizer, and it does not bloom. I want to know why what is the reason why it's not bloom? I mean, hey, it's this kind. If you can see it, I don't know.
Can you see it?
Can you hold it up a little higher?
There you go. There you go.
Okay, let's see.
That's the Nutricoat there too.
Yeah, that
That's
it looks a little bit okay. Looks like
What?
something from Andy's Orchids mounted.
yeah. I really don't know what is the name because it doesn't have a label or anything.
Well, you had a label, but we lost it.
It looks like it could use some more water. So a plant that's mounted like that can stand to get watered literally every day.
Every day? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because it doesn't have the medium to hold the moisture, it's going to dry out very rapidly. So yeah, I would just water it every day.
Every day, and I keep putting the fertilizer every week.
Yeah, that's good. You know,
Yep.
one thing that you could do, where do you have that one growing?
I have it outside, hanging in one of the pots in shade.
Okay. Is it in an area, do you have like sprinklers that come on in that area?
No,
No.
no.
It's hanging, we have an overhang in front of our front door that is probably 8 foot deep. So this is hanging toward the back of that. So it gets a lot of indirect reflected sun off the walls around, but no direct sun. And it's about
You know what you might do?
7 foot off the ground.
Okay, you say that you have this, that thing sitting in a pot, is that correct?
No, outside, hanging from a pot.
Oh, hanging from a pot, okay.
Yes.
What you might want to do is get some moss and put a layer of moss around the roots and then tie it on with a very fine, like a wire or some fish line. And that way the moss will hold the moisture around the roots, so it'll basically not dry out quite as much.
Oh,
Yeah, this is 2 years old. It has the original moss that the vendor put on the stick wherever he mounted it. The
Yeah.
roots have grown since she got it, so the roots are going around the back of the stick, and they're pretty much out in the open.
Mhm.
All right, so add some moss
Yeah.
to it.
okay. Okay. Thank you.
No, just a little more moss, yeah.
Okay. Thank
Is
you.
that it?
Okay.
Is that your question?
Yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Leslie?
On that one, I had two things. Bill, I thought you did a very good job. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank you.
Thank you.
And on that last plant that they showed, it didn't look like you said, it didn't look like it's getting enough water, but I question that it's getting enough light too. Because just the way it kind of looked. So, but I just wanted to thank you because I thought you did a very good job.
Yeah, I couldn't really see that well because I just have a little thumbnail on my screen for whatever reason. That's all I'm able to see right now.
Well, good job.
Yes, isn't it?
Kathy?
Oh, I was just going to answer Amanda, or no, Bobby's question about using Nutricoat and the regular the liquid fertilizer. I use both, but I make when I make my liquid fertilizer, I make it very weak. And I use it about once a week, something like that. But I've been doing both for years and it seems to work out fine. I haven't had any burning problem or anything like that, but you have to, don't overdo it on either one. And
Okay.
and regarding the Vandas that Bill mentioned, if you have a big tall vanda that has a lot of roots going up it, you can, and it's a vigorous plant. I have had success with cutting off the top and repotting it and making more plants. But again, you need a big plant, it has to be vigorous, and they might not all do it. That's about it.
Yeah, I think Kathy, you had also mentioned that as far as growing vandas in this area here, that the ones that have blue flowers tend to be more hardy and do a little better in our location.
There, if you don't have a greenhouse, Vanda cerulea, from which most of the blue ones are bred, is actually a rather cool growing species. It grows at a higher elevation than a lot of the Vandas. And so the blue flowered ones are generally easier to grow and bloom if you don't have a greenhouse. Whereas I have one plant that I've had for years. It's about 4 feet tall. It has never bloomed. I forget what it is exactly, but I finally put it outside in full sun all summer long. I brought it into the greenhouse, you know, when it got cold, and I think it's finally making flower spikes. It could happen. So Vandas are a little tricky. It depends on the hybrid, but they're totally doable.
That's neat. Yeah, there are a few classes of plants that I've pretty much decided to stay away from. And vandas I've avoided forever, it seems. And one time was like, well, that was what was on the plant table, so I took it. And lo and behold, I got the first one now that's actually starting to spike.
Al? Al, are you up?
The NutriCoat, yeah, the NutriCoat is 13-11-11. And I grow everything outdoors, and I use both, just like Kathy does. And I just use it in a real weak solution when I use the other stuff. But I keep the NutriCoat on it all year long.
So. Cool.
Okay. Francine.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Hi. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, good. I wanted to first thank Bill for this beginner session, because this is like really where I'm at right now. And I had about 25 of these phalaenopsis that were given to me by a florist as gifts, people given to me as gifts. And the roots, you know, are so bad that I was told to cut them off. So I end up not having any roots at all. I soak them in water to see if there's anything green. I know it's horrible looking. It's kind of funny, isn't it? But I have about 25 plants that are literally cut right here that don't have any roots. So I threw out 25 of them already, but I have some left and I want to save a few. That was my first question. I have 5 questions, so I can go really fast with all 5 or one at a time.
Do one at a time.
One at a time.
Okay, so this plant, I soaked it in water to see if there's any green. Can everybody see it? I know I saw some people laughing, but I would think that you all would say cut off the dead roots. There's exposed roots that don't have any sponging. So I cut it off. I'm left with without any roots whatsoever, but the plant looks healthy. It has healthy leaves. Is it worth saving?
It's hard to tell looking at it. It looks like you do have a fair number of roots there. Although, you know, what
Nothing green, Bill.
well, they wouldn't necessarily be green if they're still a whitish color,
Oh, yeah.
then they're probably okay. Basically, if
Oh,
they're brown,
good.
that's a problem.
No,
They actually
they're
look
the whitish
from
gray. What? So I will put it in the medium too. And my second question, what if you don't have any roots? What do you do if, let's say I cut it off all the way to the base and there aren't any roots? Is it like not going to grow? Is it going to die?
I would say probably, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Even if you have some not so great roots, it's better to keep them than to have nothing. And, you know,
Oh, darn it. Okay.
what I would do, it looks like there's a lot of moss hanging on those roots. On the one that you're showing there.
Yeah, I don't see any moss, Bill.
Well, what?
Oh, get it off. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I would very, you know, carefully pick the moss off the roots and then
Okay.
mount it up or pot it up using the orchid bark. And you could actually, I usually put a little bit of moss in with the bark. Maybe I'd break it up real fine so it's not long strands anymore, and maybe throw a handful in with the bark. And that helps it to hold enough moisture while the new bark is starting to absorb more water. Initially, the bark
Okay, can
tends
you
to,
so thank you. I have all the mixtures that I bought. Can you recycle the bark? Let's say I had a plant that didn't have any roots and I tried to keep it moist and obviously dried out. So I have this container of medium. Can I recycle it for other plants?
is that new medium?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
I mean, there's always a risk that
Transferring
that a
disease.
plant can have disease, it can have virus, and then by using the mix from one plant to another, you could be transmitting it to the new plant. So the best
Right.
rule of thumb is to not do that. And actually, when you're potting a number of plants, one of the things that you can do to keep from getting cross contamination is to just to work on everything on a sheet of newspaper. And then when you're done with the plant, wrap that all up, throw it away, and lay a new sheet of newspaper down. That way you're always on a clean
Wow.
surface. Same thing with any clippers. Make sure that they're sterilized in between, because lots of times, you know, if you open up any orchid book, they'll have pictures of plants with virus. And that doesn't always show. And I've had plants that look perfectly healthy. You test them and you get a very strong virus reading, and others that look very similar to the photograph in the book, and you test it and it's negative. I've even repeated the test, negative. So, you know, the assumption that you should always have is that every plant in my collection could have a virus.
So how do you sterilize the clippers?
You can basically dip them into a bleach solution, let them sit for a good 5 minutes or more. I use a propane torch, and in between I just I flame the cutting edge, the cutters on the torch, and then quench it in a little bit of water and go to the next plant. If you're doing it indoors and you have a gas stove,
Yeah, that's what
you can use the gas stove.
I use.
Right. Good idea.
So there's
I have a list of questions, but I'll just ask one more, or two more, because I collect rainwater, because when it rains, I like to water my plants outside, you know, or inside a week later with this rainwater. Would you suggest using rainwater for the orchids?
It's certainly going to have the lowest mineral content that you're going to get. You probably would want to use one of the orchid fertilizers that's specifically for rainwater or reverse osmosis water, because it's going to have more calcium and magnesium added back in. That's the thing that you're going to miss the most by using rainwater over tap water. So,
So that might be my
It's-
problem.
right, and the places that you would go to for that, there's floriculture up in Sacramento. And if you look it up online, it's FLOR dash culture. If you leave the dash out, it'll take you to 1,000 other floriculture sites. And the other one is a site called Kelly's Corner. And the corner is spelled with a K. And they tend to be more expensive there on the East Coast. But they do have, and I have some myself, because some of my indoor orchids, some of the species, I use distilled water. I just buy the distilled water at the supermarket. And I bought the orchid fertilizer specifically for distilled and RO water. And rainwater is going to be the same for you there.
Yes, thank you. And my last question, because I know there's probably a lot of other questions, is there anybody that would like to help me, like a personal sponsor or something? Because I'm really struggling and I really want to learn how to do this. I have 25 orchids in a sunroom and I tend to them, but I just don't know what I'm doing. Is there anybody I can call or anybody that would take me under their wing?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the newsletter, we have about 5 people that are listed as mentors. And
Mentor, that's what I need.
yeah, so yeah, no problem. I'm trying to recall who else is on the list. I think Ava Gago, Ava Saradakis, Leslie, I think, are you?
I think Kathy is.
Kathy?
I think so.
Well, they're mute, so I don't think they can talk.
Oh, but they could hear.
I'll look it up on the newsletter.
Right.
Thank you so much.
I can mention.
Thank
that-
you for your help. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Hey, Bobby, do you have another question? Your hand is still up.
And seen about the Phalaenopsis. First of all, I've had success repotting my Phalaenopsis without using the moss. I take all the moss off of the Phalaenopsis, and then I make a mixture of Orchiata with some perlite and some charcoal. And
Okay.
they seem to be
Charcoal.
growing very well in that. Just that. But my question is, in my repotting, I know that everybody has demonstrated how you need to firmly put your orchid in the barks, and I've even seen people pick up the orchid by its leaves and it doesn't fall out of the pot, right? So it's in firmly. I'm wondering whether I'm making it too firm, because in some of my orchids, not all of them, but after I water them thoroughly, I can go back and I can tip some of those pots and the water's pouring out of it. So I know if I don't tip the pot afterwards, it's going to be sitting in too much water for too long. It's not draining well, evidently. So I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I mean, not all my plants are that way. Is it? So I'm kind of like answering my own question. I'm probably packing it too tightly. And again, it's the same mix of the Orchiata, perlite, charcoal, and I don't know.
I would just, number one, I would just check and see if you don't have like maybe pieces of perlite and bark plugging some of the drain holes. Because even if you pack that stuff in really tight, it's still a very open mix. It should drain out the water. It shouldn't really hold it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never really worried too much about, gee, you have to pick up the plant. Almost everything I pot up, I put a layer of rock in the bottom. So I'm not going to be able to pick up the whole thing with the plant anyway. It'll just pull it right out. I've seen George Hatfield use a metal rod about 1 inch in diameter and actually jam it.
Yes, I've seen that too.
And I've always been hesitant because it's like, one of the first thing they tell you is don't damage the roots. And I'm thinking, you know, how can I not be damaging the roots when I do that? So I've never really worried about that. Now, the reason that they tell you to do it is there's a concern if there's any wind, or if you're carrying the plant and the plant is moving around, then the roots might get damaged just from motion. But I'm thinking, how much damage am I doing jamming it into the pot? So if I've got a pot that's really particularly loose in the pot, a plant that's loose in the pot, I'll put a stake in and tie the plant to the stake. And if it's a small plant, here's an interesting thing. I'm going to put this out in the future. I've been buying bamboo skewers, barbecue skewers at Albertsons. They're about 12 inches long, and they're not the really thin ones. They're about maybe 4 millimeters in diameter, and they're really stiff and strong. They've got a nice point on the end, so you can just jam it right into the mix. And they're great for staking small plants and the spikes on some of the smaller ones. Or you can get what they call rhizome clips that you clip on the edge of the pot, and they secure the plant in place. Personally, I would do that before I really hammered on the roots.
Okay. Would you suggest, most likely, that on those plants that I do have to tip and the water, you know, drains more, that I repot those?
What I would check, well, if you can figure out, you know, how well the mix looks in general, you know, if it's something that hasn't been repotted in a couple of years, maybe you just
He put his hand up.
Like I did it last year,
You did.
just 1 year.
What
And
I
in fact, I've seen, excuse me, in some of those clear, those plastic clear pots, some moss is growing inside. Is that an indication that it's not draining well and I should repot it? I've heard that maybe that's not good for the roots if there's moss growing inside of the pot.
Well, I've seen that when you start getting algae, and the
Algae, maybe I mean algae.
yeah, it could actually grow a mass and block one of the holes. One thing you can try is just take a small stake or a skewer and just go poke through the holes and make sure that they're not blocked
From the bottom up.
from the bottom up, and see if that does the trick.
Okay.
I also want to mention, you know, you've got your potting mix, I have my potting mix. I actually, for Phalaenopsis, I always crumble up some styrofoam packing peanuts and mix them in too. The bottom line is there's no single way to do it and have it work. And everybody kind of finds their own and what works for them. So I don't want to, you know, there are some things that you don't want to do is have the roots sitting in water all the time. But, you know, beyond that, there's like 10 ways to skin a cat. And most of the orchids aren't that picky.
Bill, speaking of water, I have a note here from Chad.
Yeah.
A suggestion for distilled water. You can get a clean, empty 1 or 5 gallon jug or bottle and fill it with the water from glacier machines outside stores for about 40 cents a gallon.
Not bad. Very good.
Let's see who's up next.
I
Al?
don't know cents about it. Gallon.
Al?
So Joe was.
Just a second. Joe, do you have something?
No, go ahead.
No, we're
Yeah,
not.
hi guys. Hey, Bobby, I have a suggestion for you. If you're not already using the so-called air cone pots,
Yeah.
if you're, say, putting an orchid in a 6-inch pot, and Francine, you could try this also, you can take a smaller pot, say a 2-inch seedling pot, and put it right in the center and push it up to the bottom of your plant, and then backfill with your bark around that. That'll also get some more air to the roots and probably will solve your drainage problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I understand that.
Okay. Let's see.
Raise your hand if you,
Why can't I unmute Al?
I don't know.
Just a
There
second.
you go.
Al?
Yeah, hello. I have a couple of things basically for both Francine and for Bobby. Bobby, there are 2 things you want to check. check to make sure that the bottom of the pot is not resting on something flat,
Yes.
as opposed to some of the pots that are concave. Also, for everybody, there's a really good video from a gentleman called Orchid Geek about repotting. That is really, really, really good. And he lives in Southern California. He works for Sunset Valley Orchids. It's called Orchid Geek. It's on YouTube. Just go to Google Orchid Geek, go to YouTube. It's got a bunch of them, but it's really, really good. And I force down the medium a lot. And I make sure that I can pick it up, because if it's too loose, the roots won't be able to grab on anything. And you won't, the roots will just die.
Yes.
Also for Francine, they make something called Michigan State University fertilizer, which is MSU, which is specifically made for RO rain water that has some special chemicals in it. And Gail had told me about it. And so if you're going to use the rainwater, that's probably what you want to do. Also for Francine,
Yes,
if
thank
you
you.
Google, you will find that there are a lot of videos that tell you about what to do when you have a phalaenopsis or almost any orchid when you don't have any roots. And it gives you some helpful tips that may work for you or may not.
I'll
But at
try.
least it gives you an idea.
Because I do want to say something. What in the beginning, everybody said to cut off all the dead roots because they could, ruin the potting soil and all that, bacteria, decay and all that. So they said, just, you have to cut off all the dead ones. Well, I had black ones on this plant and they were all black, but the leaves were beautiful. So I cut them all off.
You want to cut off some of them, and the ones that are really, you're sure are dead and stringy, but it's even better to put some of the ones that you think might be dead back in there again, because you never know when they're going to actually not be dead. And again, at least it gives the plant something to hold on to. Not all of them, but at least some of them. And as for using the medium over again, you don't know how sour that medium has gotten as well. So I know when I pot things up, I throw away all the old medium and I wash the roots really, really well so that you get off as much as you can, and pick off as much of the old medium as you can without destroying any of the root structure. And that way, you know that the medium you're putting in is all new.
Yeah.
And you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I was just being cheap and I thought, well, this plant didn't make it anyway, so the medium, didn't get used. So I'll
No.
yeah.
And I have one other question for Bobby. Bobby, are the pots you're using just draining at the bottom? Is that the only drain holes?
I have a selection of different pots that I use. Some of them are the air cone. I've got the clear one. I've got all different kinds of.
Do you have the ones that have the holes cut in the sides as well as in the bottom?
I have not as many that way. I do have some. I like those the best, but I don't have enough.
And you can always drill your own holes in the side if you want
sides of the bottom, huh?
Yeah, and that way it'll help drain out both through the sides as well as in the bottom if you have a problem. Because as Bill said, I can't imagine you being able to pack it that tight to where you still have some water not draining out. And again, like Bill, I put on the bottom some of that peanut packing stuff that I cut up on the bottom because that really can't be compacted down. And
that's a good idea. I do have that peanut stuff. So that would be a good thing to do on the bottom.
Just make sure you don't use the ones that are, just make sure you don't use the ones that they say are recyclable, because they'll just break down from the water over time. So make sure you use the ones that are not recyclable.
I have no idea what mine are. There's some packing stuff that I got out of something I got delivered.
Take it and run it underwater. If it just disintegrates in your hand, you know it's the recyclable. If it stays the same shape, then you know it's not.
Smart.
Okay, that's
Um,
all I got.
Just
Thank you.
a comment
you.
from me. If you have something to say, that's fine. If you're done, put your hand down because some people have their hands up and I don't know if they still.
My
want to
hand's
be heard.
down.
Okay, that's fine.
Carla? Haven't heard from her yet.
Right, okay, Carla?
Yes, I have 2 Laelia anceps that I got at the Santa Barbara Orchid Show just before it was canceled. I got them from Sun Valley Orchids there. The gentleman from Sun Valley said that they do really well in like a wooden slat basket and with just medium bark and perlite. And so that's where I've put them. However, my plan is to hang those baskets outdoors. I have a tree on the east side of the house, so it really only gets morning sun. And so I'm just asking for confirmation if that's going to be a good location for those baskets to be hung. And then also, will I need to be concerned if we have wind events? Like, what do you all do when you have wind events? Do you have certain things that you take to a new sheltered place? Do orchids seem to do okay weathering these kinds of wind events that we've had? If they're in hanging baskets, I just thought I'm going to need to be real conscious of the wind and get them to shelter if we have anything that's very strong. What input might you have so that I can take good care of these Laelias?
Where do you live, Carla?
Moore Park.
Moore Park. Yeah, you've got relatively mild conditions, not too different from where I am in Newbury Park. Laelias do really well outdoors. The area you're talking about sounds ideal.
Okay.
And it's Laelia anceps. There's a lot of different varieties of them.
One is Oaxaca and one is Santa Barbara Sunset.
Ah, nice. Yeah, they should both do very well. I have some in pots. Others I have mounted on cork and have them, hanging on like trellises and the like. So either way, they should do well. The temperature-wise should be fine. Yeah, potting it up in bark is fine. I would just make sure that, since it is in a basket, a lot of air circulation, that it does get watered enough.
Oh, okay. Is weekly enough?
In a basket, probably a little more than that, more frequently than that, especially in the summer.
Okay. Okay, easy enough.
If it's in an area where you have sprinklers running,
No.
no. What I've done in some areas, I've tapped into like a sprinkler line and run a drip line up a tree and then have it shoot down onto a basket or something like that. Otherwise, yeah, during the summer, once a week, that would probably be on the dry side. It would be on the dry side for it.
Okay. Well, I'm putzing around in the garden every day, so I can water them as frequently as needed. I just wanted to be sure that if they're hanging from a tree, and then there's the tree is on the side of the house, so really there's only one or two directions that wind would be sourced. Like, how careful do I need to be if it happens to be windy?
Yeah, I mean,
or just go out and look at them and let them tell me.
I do have some plants in baskets in my side yard, and the side yard is like a channel for the wind when we get a Santa Ana event, and they've done okay. The main thing is, while the thing is getting established in the basket and getting its roots out to actually anchor itself, it's going to be easy for maybe the wind to just knock it out of the basket. So you may want to just take like the twist tie garden wire and just wire the plant to the basket.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, good idea. Okay.
That should do it. That should do it.
My only concern is if I'm out of town, and anyway, I just wanted to have some input about that. My second question is the Kingianum that you showed in your backyard, is that on a rock? I mean, since it's a lithophyte, did you put it on a rock, or is it necessary?
No, actually, when they were small, they were in regular pots, and I was using bark, and I was mixing some lava rock in with the bark to keep it
Okay.
even. And also outdoors, the rock tends to keep things from blowing around. That one particular one that I showed has not been repotted in probably 20 years.
Is it in a pot?
It was in a pot.
It's in a pot. Okay.
It started off with medium bark and rock. And I'm sure by now the bark is completely disintegrated and gone. But it's happy as a clam, and it would probably be about 3 to 4 times that size. But every year after it blooms, I go and it keeps growing keikis, new little baby plants off the ends of the old ones.
Mm-hmm.
I usually end up pulling off at least 100 or more of them, potting them up, and then we sell them at our fundraiser. So it has the potential to really take off, and that's the same with all of those Australian dendrobiums. Once they get beyond like a 3-inch pot size, I'll put them in a mix of half large bark, half rock, and we're talking the decorative lava rock that you can get at Home Depot. It's not the real fine stuff. It's not the big stuff that you put in your grill. It's the landscaping rock. The other thing that works is if you go into the building supply part of like Home Depot or Lowe's, and where they have the concrete, they sell bags of I forget what the term is, but it's basically broken up rock, and it's usually granite, fairly heavy stuff. And I get the stuff that's about 3/4 inch in size, and it's not going to break down on you. It adds weight, it adds a lot of air to the mix, and that works out real well. I would, with either way you go, I would take it and hose it down and rinse it, because when you get it out of the bag, there's a lot of powdery residue that's in there. So rinse that all off, and then you can mix it in with your bark.
Okay. And what situation is your kingianum in? Like, what exposure is it? How much sun is it getting? What temperature zone do you have it in your yard?
I have them in 2 different locations. One gets some direct sun in the morning for a few hours, and then it's shaded by the house. So it's on the northeast side of the house.
Okay.
So that during the height of the day, when the sun is most intense, late afternoon, it's in the shade, but it does get direct sun in the morning. The other one gets the sun for just a couple of hours as it's peeking down the side yard.
Okay.
So it's getting more midday sun, but not for very long.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much. This has been really informative. I've enjoyed it.
I'm going to launch our poll right now. Everybody should see this, and there's just a couple questions to answer. If you would do that. And in the meantime, who do we have up next? Steve. Steve?
Yeah, hi. My question is also about wind and Santa Ana's hymns, which are mostly on shelves in the back on a northeast face, just get blown to smithereens of falling over. I haven't come up with a good way yet to keep them vertical. So I'm wondering who's wrestled with that problem and solved it.
It doesn't show there's more.
What?
It doesn't show that there's more questions.
They have to scroll it. Steve?
They don't know they're scrolling.
What's that?
I know. Who'd you ask the question of?
Everybody. If anybody's had that problem where the plants are blowing over, cymbidiums are pretty top heavy, and I can't put enough rocks in the bottom. Like maybe.
What I've done with all my cymbidiums is they're all potted in nursery pots, the black nursery pots.
Sure.
But then I've gotten the large terracotta pots. They're not cheap, but
Right.
not anything that breaks down. And then I get the right size so the nursery pot fits inside that terracotta pot, and it's not going anyplace.
All right. All right.
Before doing that, I occasionally had to fish one out of the pool. But, with the other smaller ones, like I said, I always, if it's going to be outdoors, I always put a layer of, even if it's a 3-inch pot, I put a layer of rock in the bottom of it.
Okay.
And the ones that are on shelves, I have bungee cords that if it's going to be windy, I just string a bungee cord around the front of the shelf.
Okay.
It'll go flying. So yeah.
Hmm.
All right. I like the pot idea.
Okay. Kathy,
Oh, okay, am I unmuted?
yes, you are.
Okay, let's see, regarding the cramming the plant in the pot and then holding it up by its leaves, that only works if your plant has a really good root system that you can do that with. If you have on most plants, I'm with Bill, don't worry about it. Just get it good and firm and don't worry about it. And regarding that, we have pot clips. The Marilyn Levy estate that she, donated all her plants to us. There are a lot of pot clips that I still have left that you can come over to my house and get some. And for making air cone pots, as Joe suggested, we also have lots and lots of little 1-inch pots that you can use for a certain, for making your own air cone pots, putting that upside down in your pot. And what else was I going to say? We also have from Marilyn Levy, we have a lot of good informational books. Some of them I advertised in this month's newsletter, but there are others. There are paperback, well, they're not exactly paperbacks, but they're really good and they're on different genera. And, if you want to learn, you need to, come over and get some of those books and get some pot clips and some little pots. We also have other stuff that didn't all sell from the Marilyn Levy collection. And that's all I have. And what I was going to say is Bill and Bob, and I think Alan contributed to this as well. This has been really good, and thank you and congratulations. Done a great job.
Thank you. And what we're looking for in this poll, this questionnaire is, how often do we want to do this? What's the best time? We're looking for suggestions for topics. And like that, it's like when you dealt lemons, make lemonade.
And so far we have 4 of the 19 participants who have answered these questions. Don't forget there are 4 of them. You have to scroll down to get them. Okay, who else? Leslie, do you have something else?
That's something what Bill was saying to Francine about sterilizing clippers and stuff. That also goes with not reusing pots. If you have want to reuse your pots, you really have to sterilize it. At the Huntington, if we use bleach, it has to be open less than 90 days. They label the bleach the day they open it, and after 90 days, they no longer use it for sterilization purposes. So that's important to use. Other sterilizing agents are Physan and that class of chemical, which is an antiviral, antifungal, and TSP, but the real TSP, not the fake stuff that comes out, that they have most of the time. So those were other sterilizing agents that I just wanted to mention for Francine. And I would be glad once we're allowed to go outside and play again to mentor, but until we can go outside and play again, I'll just sit here and entertain myself and go pull a weed or something. So, but I just wanted to contribute to that. So
you've got weed?
Well, I've got a lot fewer.
Again, okay, Francine has her hand up, so why can't I unmute Francine? Oh, there we go. Francine?
Hi, I was just waiting. Thank you to Leslie. I heard you and thank you. And I would like to play on Zoom if I could call you sometime and show you my sunroom and talk. We could do it through Zoom if you don't mind.
We can try. And if it doesn't work, because that might be hard to actually see the lighting that you've got coming in, because it is a limited view. But
Let's try.
we can try it. We can try, and if it doesn't work, we'll figure out something else.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you.
Howard, did you have a question?
Well, I
Howard?
just wanted to comment, Bill was mentioning about some rocks, and so Chiyoko says that they're ceramic, they're made out of ceramic.
Ceramic rocks.
Ceramic rocks.
Okay. Again, if you don't have any more comments or whatever, please put your hand down because you're still on the list. And I only have 6 of 17 participants who have gone through our little questionnaire, so would you please do it? It'll make things a lot better for us. Okay, who do I have here? Bobby, do you have something else? Bobby?
I just wanted to thank Bill very much. This was great. And I wanted to also talk to Carla, say that that Laelia anceps is a great orchid for beginners. We take them and we have them growing on our trees. And recently, I think I mounted one to the tree maybe 2 months ago, and it already has roots. It's already affixed to the tree. It stays all through the winter and all through the winds, and I water them daily, except in the winter time, then maybe a couple times a week. But perfect orchid.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they're all
Barbara's
Yeah.
up.
I have some big rocks in our front yard that I'd like to grow orchids on. They're just sitting there. And I would face north. No, we face west. Yeah, it faced west. Any ideas what to put there that would grow on that, and how to attach it?
Not sure.
You'd have to see it. You'd have to see the actual locale and the actual rock, because west facing, if it gets the afternoon sun, you could burn the hell out of anything you put there. So it just depends. It's something you've really, in my opinion, you'd really have to see it in person.
Okay, yeah, it does get
Schlep down to your house.
Pardon?
We'll have to schlep down to your house. Or you'll have to send really good pictures.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see.
Al, I guess.
Al?
Yeah, this goes to Carla. Carla, I live in Moore Park too. And if everybody will go to the speaker view, I'll show you a picture of the anceps that I have growing on my patio in a basket. It's in a pot in a basket. So I'll hold it up and hopefully everybody. Can you see it?
Not yet.
A little.
Speaker view. Okay. Let me go.
Up a little.
Oh, yeah.
Speaker view.
Yes.
Here.
It really has speaker view.
It's
Oh,
up
wow.
to the right.
How did I see it?
Yes, that's the kind of basket I have.
Okay, mine
Yeah.
just happens to sit in a pot because it just got to be too big. And I have rocks in the bottom of the pot to hold it down as well.
Okay.
Okay, but it
Okay.
just sits on the patio and the winds blow through it. And it sways obviously based upon what the wind is, but you can grow them and they grow very, very well.
Okay. Would it be better to put it in a pot and put that pot in the basket?
Well, the reason
Like
I
you
did it
have it?
was because it gave me more stability in terms of making sure that the plant didn't blow away in the wind.
Okay.
Because I
Okay.
could put rocks into the actual pot itself to
Mhm.
make sure that nothing moved or it didn't move as much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It's worked for me, but just to kind of let you know.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Mhm.
Thank
Again,
you.
we only have 7 people who answered our questions. 8 of you didn't, so please do, so we have some more input. I don't see anybody else on the list.
And it scrolls.
It scrolls, there are 4 questions. The last one is, what day of the week would you like the meetings?
Anybody have any other questions?
Nope. And I think I'm gonna
Did you
head
get
out
ours?
now because I see that, I saw that Steve was having is that a cocktail that you have there, Steve, that you didn't mix for everybody?
You officially end this then.